Hello everybody, this is Johnny. Let's do some math together. Now Dewey is thinking about fractions again. And fractions give Dewey so much trouble. Let's think about fractions with Dewey today. Now, what we're thinking about with fractions today is we're thinking about ordering them. And what that means is putting them in order and thinking about what's more and what's less. Okay? And we're going to think about this a couple different ways. So I'm going to give us some fractions to think about, and then we'll work from those. All right? So here's some fractions. We have 3/4, 2/5, 3/8, 5/6, and 2/7. Okay. Now, just looking at those, think about it for yourself. Which of these do you think is the greatest? Which one do you think is the least? How would you figure out which one's more than another one of them? Now, there's some strategies that you can use with operations and multiplication and finding like fractions. Let's do some smart things first, okay? So, a couple things that help us. Let's think about halves. Let's think about wholes. Let's think about 0. Now those things can help us because when we're just using fractions like this, we can think about how close they are, or relative they are to each of these, okay? So if I'm looking at all of these different fractions and I start thinking about halves, I can start by thinking about which ones might be closest to halves, okay? So I'm looking at 3/4, that's too much. But 2/5, I know that half of 5 is 2.5. So I know that 2/5 is close to a half. I'm also looking at 3/8. I know that half of 8 is 4, so 3/8 is probably something that would help us think about when we think about halves. 5/6, a half of 6 is 5, so that's too much. Half of 7 is 3.5, which is odd, and 2/7 isn't close. So if I'm thinking about halves, I'm thinking that 2/5 and 3/8 are somewhere in the middle. Now I'm looking at wholes. Now wholes is like how close to 1 something might be. Now there's something special about some numbers. We know that when the numerator of a number is really close to being the same value as the denominator, it's almost all there. So if you have to run 4 laps and you've run 3 of them already, you've almost run all of them. So I think 3/4 is approaching a whole. 2/5 we talked about, 3/8 we talked about, 5/6, 5 out of 6 ain't bad, so let's think of 5/6 as close to a whole. Now, 0. The other thing we know about fractions is that the numerator is very, very small compared to the denominator. Then we're getting close to not being much at all. So, of the ones that we have left, 2/7 is kind of small, okay? So we're going to think about this one as possibly the least. Now, just having thought that through, I've done no arithmetic, I've done no multiplication, I can say with some certainty or some idea that if I had to break these into categories, 2/7 would be the least. Then I'd have halves, 2/5, and 3/8 being next. And then if I looked at wholes, I could see that I should have 3/4 and 5/6 coming next. Now, I can't be sure about that because I can look at 2/5 and 3/8 and say, well, I'm not so sure there. Which one is closer to the middle or which one's greater than the other one? And I know pretty well that 2/7 is not even close to 3/4 or 5/6. So now I have some ideas about what I might do. So the question is, how do we compare these two, 2/5 and 3/8? How do we compare 3/4 and 5/6? So let's think about that a little bit more. So let's start with 2/5 and 3/8. Okay? Now, as we said before, 2.5 is half of 5. So 2 is a greater portion of 5 than 3 out of 8. So just thinking about these two, I know that 2/5 is going to be greater than 3/8. Okay, let me say that again. 2.5 5s makes a half. 4/8 makes a half. So I'm only missing a half here to make this half of a 5, where I'm missing a whole number here to make an 8. So I'm saying that 2/5 is greater than 3/8. So I'm going to have to move that and say that's a greater number. Let's think about that for 3/4 and 5/6 now. If I think about 3/4 and 5/6, I'm going to use a similar kind of thinking now. Which one of them has the greater portion of a whole piece of pieces all together getting close to the end? Okay? So if we go back to running laps, if you run 3 out of 4 laps, is that further than running 5 out of 6 laps? 5 out of 6 laps means you're closer to being done than 3 out of 4. Okay? There's a whole one left over here, 1/4 of a lap left over, whereas only 1/6 of a lap left over here. This one's only 1/4 away from a whole, whereas this one over here is 1/6 away from a whole. So in this case, 5/6 is greater. So now that I have all my numbers, I can think about this whole set here and put them in the correct order. And the way I see it is that I have 2/7, and then I compared 2/5 and 3/8, and I found out 3/8 was greater. After 3/8 comes the 2/5, because that's the closest to the center. Now when I compare the two that are closest to making a whole, I found that 3/4 isn't quite as far to being a whole as 5/6. So if I look at the whole set now, this is the order they should go in. The least is 2/7, next is 3/8, 2/5, 3/4, 5/6. And the way that I found these out was I paid attention to which fractions were closest to halves, which were closest to wholes, and which were closest to 0. So this is a strategy you might use to figure out how fractions should be arranged in order. Hope this was helpful. We'll do some more math again sometime.